At Sierra, discover top workout gear at incredible prices, which might lead to another discovery. Your headphones haven't been connected this whole time. Awkward. Discover top brands at unexpectedly low prices. Sierra, let's get moving.
This is Jay Scott, and you are listening to The Hook, the Ultimate Rock Community Podcast. Hope everyone's having a splendid day. Today's guest is an old friend of mine, Justin Barron. He's going to join us and talk about 70s Kiss versus 80s Kiss and what that all entails. How you doing today, Justin?
I'm doing great, man. What's going on?
I'm doing well. Thanks for doing this. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
So the first question I always ask any contributor or guest is the essence of the show. Like every great rock song has a hook that sucks you in. Every rock music fan has a moment where a song, an album, a performance, a band got them hooked on rock and roll. What hooked you?
What hooked me to Kiss? Well, you know, being a child that was born in the 70s, I think the visual, the cartoon characters. You know, I was born in 76. The visual can lead backwards to, I think, getting the Gene Simmons doll, like after they were popular on clearance, missing like maybe a leg, you know, a couple articles of his clothing, you know, and just knowing this band was kind of cool, and you know there was something collectible about them, and there were four of them, and each one's a little different, but I didn't know how that kind of intrigued visually. And I don't know if you want to say make it like sort of a superhero or a comic book figures, you know, something iconic about them. As a little kid who you know, and as a little kid, I love putting on makeup, and I love dressing up, and I love the whole theatrics of that stuff, of like being a magician or a magic show. The more information I got around Kiss, the more I sort of like my detective work looking into them, got more and more of that. And this was the visual, but then when I checked out the music, you know, even checking out the records from the library, Alive 2 specifically, it was just like, wow, there's something pretty cool going on here. Or seeing, I think it was on a 321 Contact or one of those shows that was, they did like the behind the scenes of like putting out the Kiss stage on the Dynasty tour, and they were testing the vocal effects for Gene on like God of Thunder and all of that stuff, which is really, really interesting. It spoke to me as a kid, and it made me, when I got into junior high, really wanted to kind of dig further and know who this band was and what they were about. And the more I found out, more often than not, I was digging it and loving it and intrigued by it, you know, and it did it for me and in a lot of ways.
So Kiss was your first experience with rock music?
Oh, man. I'm not sure. You know, I remember being in my parents' station wagon, and I heard the song Hotter Than Hell. They had a station wagon where there was an old 8-track player in it. Mm-hmm. I got some of those records, the LPs, and they were kind of beat up from the library. And I don't know. You know, I mean, FM radio was great. You know, there's a lot of great stuff on the radio. There's music like, you know, a lot of the old school Chicago stuff, and like Santana's second album, and some of the stuff that was in my parents' record collection definitely spoke to me. So I don't know, but I know in junior high, sort of coming back into, you know, adolescence, and Kiss was definitely right there. Van Halen and Kiss were like one of the first few bands that I really wanted to track down every album and just kind of just really get into it. And as I did, I really got into them. They were great.
Yeah, the first album I paid for with my own money, it was a cassette of Kiss Lick It Up. I had known of them, and I had heard them prior to that. I think the first experience I had with my awareness of Kiss was being at the grocery store with my mom and getting in the checkout line, and they have that, you know, that rack where they sell all the magazines. And I remember, I think it was a People magazine or an Us magazine that had the introduction of Eric Carr, who was the Fox, who was replacing Peter Criss, the Catman. Yeah. So I remember the images on the front cover of the magazine, and of course, as I'm waiting, I kind of grabbed it and just started looking, and I didn't know what they were, and I didn't know how they sounded. I just thought that they looked really cool. I remember them being on Solid Gold. I think they performed. I think they performed "I" from the Elder on Solid Gold, and I remember them doing interviews or seeing them on like late night shows if I was allowed to stay up at that age. I remember seeing that. But really the biggest impact was when I was at a friend of the family's house on a Friday night, and I don't know if it was a re-record of an earlier in the week episode of, it was on MTV, and it was the unveiling of Kiss without the makeup. And they showed Paul Stanley, they showed Gene Simmons, they showed Vinnie Vincent, and they showed Eric Carr, and they world premiered the video for Lick It Up, which was like this Mad Max, like end of the world apocalyptic type of, which later I found out that was actually, they didn't do anything to the set. That was actually filmed in LA as is with the surroundings. That's kind of funny. But so that was that was my first introduction to them. So I really didn't know much of them prior to that until I got older and I started to discover things probably a few years later with Kiss Alive 2. I was at a friend of my brother's house and he had Alive 2 on vinyl. And while they were downstairs doing whatever, I was up in his room just looking at that album cover and just listening to Alive 2, which had a big impact on me as well. What do you think were, in terms of you, when you listen to Kiss, now that, they're in the twilight of their career, they're at the end of the road, as they say.
Yeah.
Where do you go back? I mean, are you more of a 70s Kiss fan or are you more of an 80s Kiss fan?
See, for me, I have friends, that are clear. Like, I like Alive 1. I like the 70s stuff, anything past like Dynasty, they're disinterested. I have to say, I'm a fan of Kiss overall. I love every decision they make, choice of how they present themselves. And, absolutely not. There's great things about Kiss. There's things in them that I think they could do a little better. But, I'm just a fan of the whole thing. I found, like you said, growing up, what attracted me in was obviously the 70s, finding the Paul Stanley solo album on LP in my buddy's basement. He had a basement that had flooded. It was like his older brother or sister's album that it was just sitting there. He let me take it. And I took that home and played it. And like, that was sort of like, I think that was like the fall of being in 7th grade. It sort of led me down that path to get all that music in the next year or so. Yeah, but I like it. I like it all. I appreciate it all. The 80s. Like, I think Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley are really, really smart. I think they're really, really how they chose to adapt and change with the times. Now, if you want to call that, sort of following the trend or sort of flowing with or whatever, I definitely think those guys have an edge to them. I think there's a masculine quality to what they do. I think they're very good. I think they make overall good creative decisions, and then there's always an exception here or there. I find all those 80s albums really interesting. I think the music video is interesting. It's like marketing tools. I think how they have marketed themselves with like home video and repackaged and sold their story over and over again. It's an inspiring story. They believe in themselves, and it's about being confident, and it's about entertaining. But it's not all flash. I mean, those songs are meat and potato songs. People diss on them for not being that complex or whatever. But I mean, those guys wrote really good pop songs.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. You have your the musicians who sometimes have an elitist view on what a guitar should sound like and what a song should sound like, and sometimes the simplicity is greater than something that has like these intricate notes and these progressive style arrangements. The Beatles are never going to be accused of being great musicians either, but they could write a great song. They could write a great hook, and they were simple. It wasn't complex. And Kiss has often been compared to the heavy metal Beatles or the hard rock Beatles. I understand that comparison, and I get it.
Sure.
Especially when they were writing their first few records, it was very simple. the Kiss debut record, Strutter, Deuce, Wasn't Complex, Hotter Than Hell, which I think is a very underrated album. Dress to Kill. One of the things that always burdened Kiss, especially early on in their career, was the live show or the studio albums didn't match what was coming out of the speakers at a live show. The energy that they were able to produce. I mean, you listen to a live one, which we know that a lot of it was filtered in, especially the crowd noise, and even a live two, which I think is just as good as a live one. You listen to their early records, and it doesn't really give you that lift until you hear it live, and then you kind of go back, and then you kind of you appreciate those songs more. But Kiss has always been one that you needed to hear live.
Absolutely. I mean, they talk about that Alive One record, being sort of like a something you would take home from the show, sort of give you what that experience was. And I know most of it. I think it was Eddie Kramer who. I think they re-recorded that whole album pretty much. Like none of it's live, but it doesn't matter. They're giving you the feel of what this thing is. It's more than just the studio album. Like we're a live band. We're out. Those guys took their show to the people. They got in a station wagon and they drove all over. It pretty much broke in the Midwest, but it went everywhere.
They broke in Detroit. Yeah, Detroit was really the first Midwest big city in Cleveland, and then Chicago. Chicago. I don't know if they've ever really been as big in Chicago as they are in Detroit or Cleveland or Minnesota, but they did break very big in the Midwest, more so than they did maybe in New York or in the West Coast. And that's why when they had that reunion tour, their first show was in Detroit.
Oh yeah, Detroit Rock City.
Yeah. Because because if you listen to those albums after Alive One, The Destroyer, The Love Gun, The Rock and Roll Over, totally different feel, better production. That was one of the things that worked against them in the first few records was the songs were great, whether it's Cold Gin, Strutter, Deuce, Hotter Than Hell, Firehouse, whatever, but the production wasn't the best. Whereas when you listen to Destroyer and Love Gun, and I love Rock and Roll Over, the sound quality on those three just completely dwarfs those of the previous records.
Well, the thing is that, especially, having worked with bands and knowing a little bit about the recording process, I mean, when you're a nubile band, it's like the budget's just not there. Like you gotta have the songs down, you go in the recording studio, and you sort of get down as best you can. It's gotta sound, respectable. On an album like Destroyer, they're able to spend a lot of time in the studio and do some things different and get a hot shot producer, Bob Ezrin, but those first albums, I think they did what they needed to do, and they put those out really quickly too. I mean, nowadays you get Metallica putting out an album, once every 8 years or something like that. It's like they put out 3 albums in 2 years or something like that. It's awesome. They did what needed to be done, and the records were good enough. I mean, those records are good albums. I go over to a buddy's house and we play them. He puts them on the turntable and we listen to them, and they're good. I love listening to the Unplugged album, playing those old songs. They're good songs.
And again, once again, very simple, good hooks, great hooks, and you don't need to be you don't need to be the Rush of the world. You don't need to be the Yeses of the world. If you sometimes it's just as Kiss is, keep it simple, stupid.
Right.
And the one album that I've grown to appreciate, actually 2 albums I've grown to appreciate more as I've gotten older, is Hotter Than Hell and Rock and Roll Over. When I was younger, I always preferred Dress to Kill. Dress to Kill was my go-to record of the first 3, and I went back and forth between Love Gun and Destroyer. But now, if I have a choice, I'm listening to Hotter Than Hell or I'm listening to Rock and Roll Over, because I think Hotter Than Hell, underrated, kind of gets looked over because you talk about the debut, then you talk about Dress to Kill because of Rock and Roll Nights on Dress to Kill, Come On and Love Me, and then Rock and Roll Over really, to me, is kind of an afterthought for a lot of people. They talk about Destroyer, they talk about Love Gun. Rock and Roll Over, I think, was recorded live. Not a live album, but it was recorded live in the studio. And some of the songs on there, like Mr. Speed, is some of my favorite stuff.
All those songs, man. All of that stuff. Up into the solo albums, Kiss, the first album, up through Love Gun. It's all classic. It's all, for me, with the exception of like the cover, and then she kissed me on Love Gun, which I never really, that song doesn't really do it for me so much. But up to Through Alive 2, you mentioned Hotter Than Hell. I mean, you got Strange Ways on there, which kills. Going Blind,
Coming Home.
Oh my God! Parasite.
Yeah.
Watching You. There's not a bad tune on that album. I think the recording's kind of the production of it. Is kind of just there. I mean, you ever heard the Melvins do Going Blind? It's great, man. It's classic. And then Rock and Roll Over is another like that's just a solid classic. That's Kiss, and they're in form. They got great live show. Costumes are working. They got a thing going on. Here's another great route. Here's another classic album. Calling Dr. Love.
It's got Ladies Room. Yeah. It's got Hard Luck Woman. It's got I'll See You in My Dreams.
Yeah.
Really good stuff.
Yeah.
Really good stuff.
Yeah, opens up with I Want You. That's great. I think when I saw Kiss on the Hot in the Shade tour, and they went on for an encore, they had a big Sphinx on stage for the regular show. And it was huge. It came out of the mouth, and then the Sphinx, lowered. I'm sure fans who would listen to this would know this, but the Sphinx lowered, and then they brought up like a three-dimensional Kiss song, the iconic Kiss song. The K was a little funky. And I think if I remember correctly, Paul came out and did I Want You. I don't know if he opened back up with that, but it was he had a mirror ball came down, and it was just classic. It just I'm sorry, but you don't have a 40+ year career with a bunch of turds, just the songs. The songs are good. Pop ties into where the musicians they were channeling and loving at the time. It was heavy, and it was. I think it probably was directed and marketed more towards. Obviously, all rock and roll towards kids and teenagers, but they're probably like your the little brothers band, the older brother like Zeppelin or even the Stones, and the little brother maybe like Kiss. It doesn't matter. Here's my entry in. It worked for me.
One of the things with Kiss is as they moved on throughout their career in the 70s was the fact that after the solo records, they kind of became more of a pop culture act, more designed for kids than
sure.
Because I remember being at that grocery store with my mom, seeing the Halloween costumes, seeing the dolls.
Right.
There were so many. You went from influencing so many different people, right? So many different musicians speak of the 76, 77 tours as, especially guitar players when they talk about Ace Frehley. They saw Ace and they wanted to play guitar. They saw the flying guitar going in the air, and that's what they wanted to do.
Right.
So
the flying smoking guitar.
Yeah. So when they come back after the solo records, after Alive 2, the solo records, really Ace Frehley is the only one that really did well. Paul Stanley had some mild success, but Jeans and Peters pretty much bombed. They go in and they record Dynasty, which is labeled as the disco record in the Kiss collection. And I don't know if that's fair. They've got, obviously, I Was Made for Loving You is considered a disco song, but they, at that point,
I think Sure Know Something is kind of disco-y too. It's got that feel. It's got that bass line. It's got that sort of disco. So it feels like what was in the air at the time, and it's fine. Whatever. I look at that and the whole body of work, but they were doing with the Stones and Rod Stewart. They wanted a piece of what was going on in pop too, and. You can look at that two ways, but again, for me, it's a good album. I like the song. I like a lot of that disco music from the time. I grew up on the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack and movies, and I kind of derailed you here a little bit. No, Dynasty. I think that's interesting, and I think it works as an album because there's like 4 Ace songs on there. Like Ace had the most popular solo album and the most sort of like acclaimed solo album. He's on there. 2000 Man.
Yeah, great cover.
Save Your Love.
But no,
I'm looking at my cassette tape right now. I'm just looking at the track list.
But no, it was. Yeah, but I think at that point when they came back and they started to become, they had the Kiss lunchbox, they had the Kiss toys and Halloween costumes and all that stuff. They started to become more of a little kid band, and even Gene and Paul have talked about this in interviews over the years, that little kids started coming. It started to become more like the circus, like Barnum and Bailey, where kids would come with their families instead of it being more of the kid in school, the rebel, the disenfranchised youth. It started to lose its way a little bit. Probably, around the Dynasty era, the Unmasked, of course, the Elder. We could talk about that, but it seemed, and they even talk about this, that it just didn't. It wasn't doing what they intended it to do. It became something completely different.
I've heard them say that in all the interviews. I think a lot of some of what they say sometimes is in relation to what they're pitching now. Because I've heard them say that it was just families and stuff, but that's where it evolved to, And then they were saying, "Oh, it was just families coming," but that's when they were sort of promoting a harder Kiss, a heavier Kiss, Revenge era, and even the reunion tour on, there's pictures of Paul Stanley posing with naked women and Gene Simmons and Playboy. It was definitely there were some R-rated aspects, as there was back in the 70s, but in Dynasty it became more PG or almost G-rated at some points. I'm as a kid intrigued by, the Phantom of the Park movie and whatever, but now it's gone back to like a legacy bands where their fans are bringing their kids. It's sort of a rite of passage. So I don't think Paul would, bitch about families coming, because it has become a rite of passage. So I think it's definitely geared towards adolescents, but then adolescents grow up and it becomes a generational thing for kids to discover. I think it does speak to the little kid. I think it does speak to the child that wants to be a superhero and wants to, they're like, four superheroes, four rock gods on stage. The God of Thunder goes up to the top of the building, and fire bursts, and these things about the God of Thunder or the War Machine, being unholy or whatever it is. It's
which is a great song.
It's fun. It's fun. It's theatrical, and so I think the harder edge speaks to initially the rebellious teenager, the adolescent discovering sex and girls, and so they're giving you some of that. We're the rock gods, or sort of the gatekeepers. A lot of the stuff we're the ones indulging, and then. I wouldn't say, I don't say they sold it out, but they sold that. Then it's like, okay, we can sell, it's trending with kids. So we'll sell it to an even younger demographic. But I know Gene Simmons talks about it in one of I don't know, what is it? Kiss, Extreme Close Up, or I forget the movies they did in the early 90s. We talked about, you climb one mountain, then you want to climb another one. You get a taste of that and you want to do that one. You want to accomplish the next goal. And, so they've gotten fame on this level, and they want to go to the next level. And I can't blame them. There are a lot of bands that have stayed the same. They get a little stale. That's what I find interesting about 70s Kiss versus 80s Kiss. To me, it's all really interesting. I find all the albums really interesting. Even though if there's a song or two that I'm not into, with the exception of like Psycho Circus is like my least.
Well, that was more 90s though, wasn't it? I mean, that was more. But as they moved on in the late 70s to the early 80s, you had Dynasty, which even though most Kiss fans at that time didn't like that record, it still produced a top 20 hit with I Was Made for Loving You, which now if you have a top 20 hit, it's not as big of a deal as it was back then. For a rock band like Kiss, who, was not considered mainstream, to have a song like that and one of their biggest hits, it says something of the times, because disco really had taken over, and then you had the beginning of punk really in full swing in 1979. So they had a lot of success with that, and then they went in and did Unmasked, and I know you and I have talked about it before. I think that record it holds up a lot better than people thought it would originally. I think now if you listen to it, it's got some really good stuff. It's definitely more of a pop record along the lines. It kind of continues with the Dynasty music style. into the early 80s, with Unmasked. And I think, if you listen to some songs like Shandy and Tomorrow, and I know there's others, or not, Is That You, which I think is a good song. There's a lot of Ace material on that record, because I think they wanted to capitalize on the fact that Ace had such a big solo album, bigger than the rest of the guys.
Again, bringing Ace in, letting him be more of a contributor to material. You've got Two Sides of the Coin, Torpedo Girl, Talk to Me.
Talk to Me, yes,
yeah. Paul Stanley gave him a lot of credit for Talk to Me. Again, that album conceptually is kind of interesting, where they're kind of teasing that they're going to take their makeup off, and obviously at that point there still was obviously some intrigue, with the culture about what do these guys look like without their makeup. So they were able to still play with that. I listened to that album. It sounds very much like the production sounds like yacht rock a little bit to me. Like it sounds like a little bit more like a Doobie Brothers or Michael McDonald or something like that. Like a Kenny Loggins or something production of the time of the radio. But that's where I see it's like Kiss made it, and then they're gonna go, okay, we're gonna do another pop, we're gonna disco. Then it's like, okay, where do we go next? Well, let's try to do a little more mainstream rock. My problem with Kiss is they discredit some of the foundation that they've already laid, and they try to kind of branch out a little bit. And instead of coming back to that foundation, they'll sort of, they take it for granted. I think it's too obvious for them to kind of, like that album I was saying, it sounds very much like a yacht rock album, like in terms of production. Mm-hmm. Some of the hard edges have been rounded a little bit, and the songs are good, but it's very much of that time. And I think that, obviously they want to be contemporary. They want to, they don't want to sound like something that happened 10 years ago. But I don't know. I don't know the numbers those guys were being given by management, and what kind of advice they were being given, or what songs were on the radio that were really inspired to them. I know Paul Stanley, he's got his ear to the ground in terms of where he wants to go. This person had a hit with this, I could do this too. And he usually does. But that album to me, it's just a little conceptually, they were flirting with the idea of taking their makeup off and flirting with the intrigue they had as a band, a masked, band where you didn't know their identity. And I don't know. It's not one of my favorites, but
I think that whole period. Yeah, I think the whole period, with those three albums, Dynasty, Unmasked, The Elder, it was kind of a lost period for kids and for Kiss. And I don't mean that as throwaway music. I just think that they were searching for an identity to regain their identity. They were having internal problems. I mean, obviously Peter Criss left after Dynasty, and then Ace Frehley left after The Elder, and there was a lot of internal battles and struggles going on. So I think it was they were going in a lot of different directions, and I think that they lost the essence of what Kiss was during that period. And there's moments where they have it, right? There's moments on all three of those records that you can say, that's Kiss. That's what Kiss should sound like. Yeah. But I think as a whole, the direction was lost. And I think especially that moment, maybe not so much The Elder, but Dynasty and Unmasked, instead of them leading the influence, they were kind of behind the influence. They were playing catch up, or they were trying to cross over into other areas of music to grow their fan base and become more mainstream.
Absolutely. What I find really interesting about this period, it's sort of in terms of them being sort of a legacy, 40 some 4 years as a band, the zeitgeist of what that sort of space they were occupying in pop music, the Kiss guitar player, the lead guitar player was changing from 70s guitar to 80s guitar. And obviously that resulted in the changing from Ace Frehley to the guest players that played, solos on Creatures of the Night, to Mark St. John, or Vinnie Vincent, Mark St. John, and then Bruce Kulick, and Bruce Kulick sort of became the stay of that. It went from, Jimmy Page and and Tony Iommi and other icons, from Richie Blackmore and just people that were really groundbreaking to, Eddie Van Halen and Randy Rhoads sort of setting the new trend for 80s guitar. And everybody was kind of playing catch up to that. And where Ace Frehley was a rock god in the 70s, I'm not saying he doesn't fit into that, but I think for Kiss to be able to take off the makeup and be an MTV band, I think they needed, losing Ace, they had to just kind of embrace the trend and go with it and become an 80s, an 80s hair metal band, a kind of, I think they took a lot of cues from Van Halen. I think they saw Van Halen and saw the excitement and new energy of this new thing. And, they kind of took some of that wild jungle man sort of, thing that David Lee Roth was. I think Paul Stanley's definitely embracing that, Asylum and Animalize.
Sure. With the different colors and, you look at each album they released in the 80s, it was a different look on each album. And kind of going back a little bit with The Elder, The Elder is regarded as Kiss's worst record outside of maybe the Peter Criss solo album. But as again, like Unmasked, as time moves on, the album does sound better than it did back in the day. I remember remember the big deal about The Elder was that it was out of print and you couldn't get it anywhere. And no record store had it, and it was like the big thing to get The Elder. And then when they re-released it, I remember getting it and listening to it, and I was like, it's all right. It's definitely Kiss, but it's got some good moments on it. It's got some good songs, but I don't think they release an album that is so accepted by Kiss fans and even some non-Kiss fans like Creatures of the Night. And I don't think that album happens if Elder didn't bottom them out, because even Paul Stanley talks about the crowds during the Creatures of the Night tour. The U.S. crowds were, they were playing to half empty arenas, and they had such pushback. And I almost think that they're still kind of paying for that era of Kiss. They're still kind of paying for the 79, 80, 81 Kiss era, where they became like Barnum and Bailey. They became more interested in selling stuff to kids, whether, the Pez dispenser or whatever. And then they had this concept album that completely fell flat. I think in some ways they're still paying for that in terms of people taking them serious. Now, I could be wrong, but because I look at some of the stuff, I used to say that if Kiss had the makeup on and they released Creatures of the Night, Animalize, and Lick It Up, the order's kind of screwed up there, but you know what I mean? They would have been just as huge as 70s Kiss when Alive came out, and that's what broke them.
Yeah, I have some thoughts about that. One of the things I know about Kiss is I think the blue collar work ethic that exists in those guys and connects to their fans. I don't think Gene and Paul have ever forgotten what it's like to be poor and not have money. And so I think that those guys have that ethic of where they want to kind of go out and keep earning and earning as much as possible. And if that means, I don't think they water down the music, but if that means kind of selling it, it's not even a compromise. It's just like they wanted a disco track, so they go and they get a couple disco tracks and get a hit. There's a psychic cost for that, but that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to. I think they want to be on the top in the premiere, in the zeitgeist, and I don't think it's dishonest. I think those guys have a good ear for what's popular, and I think they've had some really good taste and sort of like what they've written over the years. For me, The Elder, I feel like The Elder is just as an album. I wanted more. Like I would have loved that to be a true double album. Kiss's double album, concept album with Bob Ezrin. I wish they would have went the full 9 with it. Like I feel like there's you're going to do a concept album, you want to throw back to like Tommy or Quadrophenia or, Pink Floyd The Wall or something, make it a double album. Give me something interesting. And if it bombs, I don't really care. But that album is kind of weird, and there's, Mr. Blackwell and Gene stuff is really just kind of odd and very much in his character, and there's some rock and roll on there. It didn't sell, so they disown it. But a lot of fans really dig it, and I dig it too. I mean, is it my first one I put on? No, but I play it sometimes. I genuinely appreciate it, and I think a lot of fans too. But unfortunately for Kiss, if it doesn't sell a gazillion albums, then it's sort of a failure, and then they want to disown it. And unfortunately, and fortunately, I mean, for Kiss, it's the bottom line is being a successful rock and roll outfit, making money. They roll into town, and so they'll disown sort of, hey, we're Barnum and Bailey, but then they say that, and then they come out with an album called Psycho Circus. Have a circus opening up for them at the Dodger Stadium show, which I saw. So it's a little bit of a contradiction, and those guys contradict themselves. But I think they're trying to put on a good show, and they say this themselves. They're entertainers first, and musicians second. They're definitely entertainers. They sort of have some misgivings, although they'll has a tie-in with McFarlane Toys and some other stuff. And I would have liked Kiss to come back after the reunion with an album called Four of a Kind, where they're sort of suited up as, four different kings from a card deck, and maybe Psycho Circus was a song on that, but to me, it was kind of a corny concept. It just didn't, it felt like a step back from the massive success, and it was like Kiss is back, and I wanted those guys I wanted my heroes to kind of be back together, and we know now that didn't quite happen, but at the time, going from transitioning from 70s Kiss to 80s Kiss, as a relevant sort of, top 40 MTV playing band, like, the growing pains of that is finding the right guitar player. And the guitar players they had were all interesting, like the Elder, you do have Ace playing some great stuff on that. And then on the Creatures of the Night, you've got several people playing.
You got Bob Kulick. You've got Vinnie Vincent, who was Vincent Cusano back then.
Yeah.
You have in fact, the guy that would later played for Mr. Mister was the lead on Creatures of the Night, and he was considered to be the replacement for Ace, but the one thing he couldn't do was sing, and they wanted someone who could sing backup vocals, and he couldn't do it. But even as you moved on from the Elder and you went into Creatures, which is one of my favorite records, Kiss Lick It Up has a personal place in my heart because it's the first record I ever bought. And then Animalize came out, and Animalize really almost brought them back full circle. I mean, they had the popularity with Heaven's on Fire. A lot of some of the rest of the record is not as strong as I would say a complete record like Creatures or Lick It Up is, but it definitely had the hit, and it also had the song Thrills of the Night. But then again, you had the issue with Mark St. John, who I think only did one live show during the whole time because he developed a problem with his hand. And, they then went with Bruce Kulick, Bob Kulick's brother, who was, not the flashiest guitar player, but very steady, and he's a good player. They came out with Asylum after that, and Asylum again had the song Tears Are Falling, which I think was a top 40 or top 20 hit. So when you look at Kiss in terms of their relevance, yes, they had valleys, and they had pretty deep valleys of the popularity not being strong. But then, they had these upswings again. They had the upswing, obviously 70s Kiss, and growing that into Alive 2. They had kind of the dead period, I want to call maybe, in terms of just not being the band they once were in like the late 70s, early part of the 80s. And then they slowly built it back up, and then they culminated with Tears Are Falling and Heaven's on Fire. I thought Crazy Nights was a little bit of a step back in terms of their creativity. And I think Hot in the Shade was, even though Hot in the Shade had another big hit with Forever. And then Revenge, working with Bob Ezrin again, just a kick-ass record, man. I mean, Revenge was just an awesome album. And again, they wrote a couple songs with Vinnie Vincent for that record.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I agree. I find the Asylum and Animalize, reverse order, Animalize, Asylum. I find those albums really interesting. I remember listening to podcast, Ken Mills' podcast, and they broke down. I think it was Animalize with Mark St. John. And there's a really cool outtake of the recording of like Thrills in the Night on YouTube, a longer session. That's really cool. I definitely recommend checking that out. Yeah, Crazy Nights. There's also, they also talk about Gene sort of being absentee and doing movies, and Paul sort of minding the shop at the time, and carrying the band. And he went out and did a solo tour in there. Crazy Nights probably my least. It's very polished. It's very, it sounds just like it's very hit oriented. There's some White Snake style ballads on there that are, I love White Snake. I love, I just, not an album I play a lot. I revisited Hot and Shade. I picked up the vinyl. I got a steal on a brand new copy. It's a dense album. There's a lot of material on there, maybe a little bit too much. I play it now. I like it. That's the first tour I saw. Those songs, Hide Your Heart, and they definitely had a heavier feel to them. I mean, that's when they're kind of shedding some of the '80s glam stuff. They're getting a little bit more, and then in their photos, they weren't so poofed up hair. There was some leather involved, some denim. They were wearing, Paul Stanley and Eric Carr wearing denim and still have boots on. But there wasn't a bunch of like bikini clad women in the videos and all that stuff. I just find really interesting. I wish on that Hot in the Shade tour, which is a gargantuan tour, I wish they would have done a live 3 with Eric Carr, because it was a really great tour, and they were still playing some of those songs from the '80s, like what's the one off Lick It Up? That's
you got All Hell's Breaking Loose. You have, is it a Gene song or a Paul song?
Then it Fits Like a Glove. It just Fits Like a Glove on that tour, and it was great. There were some of those songs they don't do anymore from the '80s. They're still playing, and Eric Carr was a part of that. I would have liked them to do, or even if a live 3 would have been even a double album. I think it was a double album, but it would have been cool to have a live album with Eric Carr, in that '80s period, because a live 3, which came out after Revenge, which I get that Eric Singer revitalized them in a lot of ways. Some of that '80s stuff kind of got glossed over to kind of go back to some of the '70s, which is all great. As a fan looking at the overall catalog, it's just, I have to look at it and find it interesting and just kind of plug in and enjoy it. I have less critique of, I enjoy it more than I don't, I definitely enjoy it,
Yeah. One of the interesting things about the Hot in the Shade album is it features the song Hide Your Heart, which Ace also recorded on Trouble Walkin'.
Yep.
Which was interesting.
Doesn't Michael Bolton have like a co-write on that or something?
That's Forever. Michael Bolton has the co-write on Forever. I think Hide Your Heart.
It's on Forever. Okay.
Yeah, I think
Desmond Child, Paul Stanley, Holly Knight. I'm looking at Ace set.
Yeah.
Right now, I heard that they were going to bring Ace back at that time. I don't know. I haven't gone looked much into that story or whatever, but I've heard that from some Kiss fans. Somebody could enlighten me on that. I always thought when they had Ace back in the band, why didn't they do Hide Your Heart with Ace and let, Ace sing a verse and Paul sing, to trade off? I thought that would have been kind of cool. That was a great video. I loved all that classic MTV. You got a helicopter flying around
that was a great video. Yep. Yeah.
Was that an LA hotel or a New York hotel? I can't remember. There was some name on the top of it.
I forget what it was too, but no, excellent video probably.
Yeah. I think it was New York because there's a subway in there. And it's got to be.
That's a good point. I think, though, that, out of all the videos in the 80s, I mean, I always liked Lick It Up and All Hell's Breaking Loose because it was like this Mad Max concept. And,
great.
you know, it was, great. I mean, All Hell's Breaking Loose is just all about debauchery and kicking over bonfires and just, it was very interesting. And then the Crazy Nights videos were, they're kind of blah. But, I do think Hide Your Heart was one of their better videos of that era. That was and Rise to it too, because when they brought back, they're doing their makeup in the beginning in the dressing room, and they go into Rise to it. So you could tell that they were thinking about it or moving towards that. I mean, obviously after Hide Your Heart, Revenge comes out. Now it was a Live 3 that was on the Revenge tour, I believe.
Yeah.
And then they were going to do a new album, or no, they started recording that album that was like a grunge record. What was that album called?
Carnival of Souls.
Yes. They started recording that, and they never released it, and then that's when the MTV Unplugged happened, and that's when they brought back Ace and Peter.
Yeah. Well, I think that they, I think they were probably last to figure out, what was going on with their legacy. But all those grunge bands loved Kiss. All those guys, just loved them. And they had the Kiss tribute album, and then they had Anthrax also. And Anthrax, I don't lump into the grunge. I think the Sound of White Noise is a little more in that direction from not just the time period. But Anthrax was covering Kiss, and giving them, Scotty Ian's always been a big, publicly acknowledged that he's a Kiss fan, and so they were getting the props from the bands that were younger than them, and giving them the accolades. And finally, it was just like, we're elder statesmen here. Let's claim this. Let's cash in here. Let's reclaim this. And rightfully so, because I know without makeup, I saw that Revenge tour, and I was a little disappointed with the stage. There wasn't the three-dimensional Kiss letters, light-up Kiss letters that they had on Hot in the Shade. They had a Statue of Liberty on stage. I mean, I guess it was kind of cool, like a post-apocalyptic New York. But it was the face came off, and there was a skull behind it, which it's okay. It's a little corny. They had a Kiss. It was yellow with black letters on it, backdrop that came down. I want that sign. I want that iconic sign. A three-dimensional sign that comes down. To me, that's them playing in front of that is Kiss, which they've forgotten now. It's all just an LED video projection, which I think you lose something with that. No, but it was the Revenge tour. I guess sonically, I mean, Eric Singer brought a fury to that band. I'm sure they were. I can't help but not think, losing their bandmate Eric Carr. We got to do this right. This other guy stepping in. Let's make sure we do this.
Well, Eric Singer was part of the Paul Stanley solo tour in the early '90s that he did.
Yeah.
So he was part of that band, and that's kind of where the connection was.
But that Revenge, that Alive 3 album sounds huge.
It does.
Huge,
it does. Yeah.
It really. I love that album.
The live version of I Was Made for Loving You just sounds phenomenal. Yeah. Sounds incredible.
Paul's got some great one-liners between, introductions to the songs. And then they also paid tribute to their past numbers in when you open it up. I mean, I first had the CD, I have the LP now as well, but Ace and Peter, We Won't Forget You, and it's kind of an acknowledgement to those guys, really. And they I guess they have always resold and repackaged what they were in the 70s. That's what a lot of those videos were, the mid to late 80s and not early 90s. And I love that. I love that marketing of themselves, and it's fine. I think it's great. It's great for a new fan to kind of come in and get exposed to that. But I mean, I think 70s Kiss to 80s Kiss to 90s Kiss and beyond, it's all interesting. I just find those guys as a cultural force of entertainment. I'm interested to see what they do next and see I like it when Paul Stanley, steps into his best shoes and writes and produces a new album. When you got Gene firing on all 8 cylinders, they're going to be better than not when they're really bringing it. And that's what I appreciate about those guys.
Well, last question before we end the podcast.
Yeah,
they're doing their end of the road tour.
Yeah,
what's your interest level on seeing them this one last time?
Well, I definitely want to see them. They came through town, and I was on the fence about going. My issue in the last few years with Kiss is, I feel like they have, when something is around so much, it ceases to become special. It ceases to have the magic. I always felt like Kiss could have become more like the Rolling Stones and more of a, we did this reunion tour. Let's take a couple years off, regroup, write a good album, and go out on tour again. But then they come right back. They come right back, and it's like, yeah, we're making money. We got to keep on doing it. And people get, I saw them on the first farewell tour, and the 2 shows at Rosemont Horizon were sold out. And then they came back in the fall to World Music Theater, and the grass was empty. And it's like, it's kind of felt like beating a dead horse. Like, how much are you going to try to milk this thing? And it becomes less special at that point. So in recent years, Kiss has been around, and I know they're playing with Eric and Tommy, who are fine players. I think they do a particularly good job. Definitely would I want to see them again. I did see them at the Open Air Fest. It wasn't scaled down show on a festival stage. It didn't have any specialness for me. There was just something missing. And I was sort of like, why? Like, what's going on here? It's a reunion. We're going out again. Oh, we got Ace. Oh, we're doing this thing. What's the reason we're going out? I think they want to be like this relevant band that's just like a contemporary force. And they've been around a lot in smaller versions of what they have been. And it's something that's a little bit of the magic is lost. But from what I've heard about this last show, it's really, really good. I know Paul Stanley isn't singing. He doesn't have the range he quite had back in some of the stellar performances of yesteryear. I'll still go. I didn't believe that the last time around. I don't believe a lot of what those guys say when they. I don't think they're going to leave money on the table. I can't see them just.
They never have. They never have before.
There's money to be made with Ace coming back or Ace sitting there, or just it's such a well-oiled machine. I can't see them wanting to pack it in completely. And I know Paul Stanley's a consummate performer, as is Gene Simmons. Those guys love being on the road. I think they'll extend it. I think they'll extend it longer than the shorter. So I do have interest in seeing it. I just want there to be an element of magic, and it's something that connects me back to that little kid that finds magic in that, and that's what initially brought me to Kiss as a kid. The magic of the superheroes, which was enough to kind of bring me on board to follow them from the 70s through the 80s and then beyond, and still, for the most part, really appreciate those guys and look up to them as quote unquote artists and entertainers.
Well, good deal. So. I know you got to run. I wish we could talk about this for another hour because I think there's so much more we could talk about it, but I know you got to get going.
Sure.
I do appreciate the time. I do appreciate you doing this. Thanks again, Justin.
Yeah.
And, once again, Justin Barron talking about Kiss on the Hook. Thanks for listening, everyone. I appreciate it.
All right, take care. All right, bye-bye.